that we're going to talk about is going to be the cutaneous innervation for the back. Cutaneous innervation meaning sensory branches that are going to pick up signals and then bring back a sense of sensation to the spinal cord and the central nervous system. So right now we're looking at the 11th thoracic nerve. And before we go into the rami, let's start from the spinal cord and work our way out. So right now I have highlighted the 11th thoracic nerve, again named for the vertebrae on top, right? As it comes through the intervertebral foramen, it's going to be named for the vertebrae that's on top. So if we follow the nerve back to the spinal cord, we have, like we saw before, an anterior and a posterior branch. So the anterior branch is going to send out motor innervation, and the posterior branch is going to welcome back in sensory information. So that all conjoins to this 11th thoracic nerve. And so our rami are going to split from that common nerve. So we have an anterior ramus and a posterior ramus. Ramus is just a fancy word for branch, but that's just going to give you a picture of how the nerve comes off the spinal cord. And so now that we have that down, we can take a look at which sections of the back these rami deal with. So it's going to be different locations and different regions for the back that each of the rami are going to cutaneously innervate. So the first thing we're going to look at is the dorsal rami, as it says on your lab sheet, or the posterior rami of the thoracic spinal nerves. Okay, so we'll take a look at the left side here. And let's throw on the skeleton so that we know where we are. Okay, so we notice that the highlighted branches here, which are the posterior or dorsal rami of the thoracic level, are really going to deal only with the medial part of the back. You can see these fibers don't go out far laterally, so they stay nice and close to the vertebral column. And then if we were to look at the back of the neck at the cervical level, we would also see just a very medial locus for the dorsal rami. And so that is in comparison to the ventral or the anterior rami that are going to come off the spinal nerve. So if we take a look at that, again, at the level of the thoracic section, we can see that the branches are going to come off farther. So we notice that they really go out laterally on the back and then along the length of the ribs. Right, if I turn around and see just how far these go. I'm looking at the left side here, but we can see that the ventral rami are really going to branch out lateral, far from the spine, but those dorsal rami coming off of the nerves are going to stay nice and close to the vertebral column. And if you wanted to study that on this program, you'd have to type in on the search bar posterior rami of thoracic spinal nerve and anterior rami of thoracic nerve, just to look at the regions in which that cutaneous innervation goes across the surface area for the back. Okay, so that's all our sensory information. And again, the sensory information, when we get past the spinal nerve to those roots, that'll go through the posterior root, right? Because that's taking in information on sensation, whereas the anterior roots that are coming out of the spinal cord are going to send motor fibers to the muscles. So away and then back. So we have those different directions there. which is definitely important. So don't mix those up because you will not see the end of that. Okay. So that brings us to our next section, and we're going to take a look at these joints and the ligaments that deal with the back. Okay, so let me throw on the connective tissue. So we have a ton of different joints, which we'll see at all levels of the spinal column, and some that are only in certain sections. Okay, so let me just reset everything on this so we can take a look at that. Okay, so on to our connective tissue. The first joint that we're going to look at is going to be our zygapophyseal joint. Not an easy one to pronounce, but a fairly easy one to identify because these are going to be our facet joints that are synovial. So you might have gone through the types of joints within the body, but these zygapophyseal joints are going to be the synovial joints that are going to run from the top of the vertebral column down to the sacral section as well. So it spans the whole length, and these are going to help us in facilitating and controlling our flexibility. And so where these are is wedged between the superior and the inferior articular facets or processes of adjacent vertebrae. So if I'm looking at the spine posteriorly, I'll notice that on each side we have these zygapophyseal joints. And then if we remember our vertebrae structure, that joint that exists between the inferior facet, and this is just an example, but if we're looking at the second lumbar vertebrae, we'll notice that the inferior facets are going to articulate or join with the superior facets of the third lumbar vertebrae or the lower vertebrae. And so these joints are going to exist right between those processes. And it's synovial, so it's going to permit us to have a gliding motion, and that gives us the flexibility that we need. Okay,